Does autism exist in Africa? That's a good question. And that's the question we're going to answer in today's vlog. So stay tuned. I'll be right back. Hey guys, welcome to my channel. I am DC the Purple Diva, and you are in Chronicles of an Artsy Autism Mom. Today, I'm going to be talking about the facts about autism in Africa. But before I do that, please like, share, and subscribe to this channel. And if you're on other social media, on Instagram and on Snapchat, I am DC the Purple Diva. On Twitter and on Periscope, I am the Purple Diva DC. And if you're on Facebook, you can find my Facebook page, which is DC the Purple Diva's Chronicles of an Artsy Autism Mom. Now, before I get started, I always have something to drink, but today we're just drinking some regular H2O. Because it's a little hot this afternoon, so not drinking tea, but we are going to drink a little water. Wow. So in honor of talking about autism in Africa, I'm doing a head wrap day for you guys today, and I got on an African top and I'm showing a little skin. You can even see one of my tattoos on my arm. So the first thing we want to do is answer the question about, is there autism in Africa? Of course, autism exists in Africa. Autism exists all over the world. As a matter of fact, worldwide, it's about 1 in 160. So 1 in every 160 children is going to be affected with autism. And it's really children who become adults, because as you know, I have an adult with autism who was once a child with autism. But let's talk about Africa. And I'm talking about all of the countries in Africa, because we all know that Africa is not a country, it is a continent. And there are like over 50 countries on that continent. But the autism knowledge on the continent of Africa is far behind the rest of the world. And that is something that should be very, very concerning to us, because by the year 2050, 40% of the children are going to live on the continent of Africa. 40% of the children in this world will be on the continent of Africa. Let me say that again so that it sticks in. So we're going to go over the things about autism in Africa. So I'm going to use the United States as an example, because in comparison to the majority of the other countries in the world, the U.S. has probably the most research and has the most treatments, shall we say, for autism. But we started our autism research in the 1950s. No, sorry, the 1940s. It was over 3 decades later before any type of research was done on the continent of Africa. And it was done firstly, I believe, in the country of South Africa. So one of the things about autism in Africa is that it is diagnosed much later. Here in the United States, we have a lot of early intervention, and a lot of children are diagnosed with autism between the ages of 2 to 4, like my son was. But it's very, very different in Africa. In Africa, the average age that a child is diagnosed with autism is somewhere between 8 and their early teens. And because of the late intervention and diagnosis for autism, a lot of these kids are nonverbal. A lot of them are nonverbal. Now, one of the other things that is a big difference between autism here in the United States and on the continent of Africa is cultural. Unfortunately, in countries like Nigeria and Somalia, the knowledge, even in the medical community, is very, very low. People, in some instances, they put it off to it being a Western disease, that it came from the West and jumped over to Africa, and that's why it's in Africa. I know that sounds completely ridiculous, but that's a fact. And then you also have to take into consideration, because most of the countries in Africa culturally are very, very spiritual, in many instances, because the only real knowledge that a lot of people have in Africa is of what they consider infantile autism. That in a lot of these countries, they're thinking that the child may have a mental illness or that they are possessed by a spirit. And when these things are happening, because of the culture, sometimes they go to their traditional faith healers or healers, witch doctors, instead of going to medical professionals. And because the medical professionals don't really know a whole lot, it's a very unfortunate situation. Now, there is good news, because they are, it is getting better. I mean, in the 2000s, things are getting better. But you have to think about the fact that in the U.S., we started this back in the 1940s, and it's really starting to get more awareness in the last 20 years in Africa. So I'm going to give you like some examples. Like I gave you the example of them thinking that it's a Western disease. That's one of the beliefs in the country of Somalia. In Nigeria, probably up until maybe very, very recently, about 40% of the pediatric, nurses that deal with children thought that it was, something paranormal or supernatural that caused the autism, and that it wasn't a neurodiversity. So one of the other things that I wanted to go over was that 51% of the children in country, 51% of the children, let me get myself together, 51% 51 to 71% of the children are nonverbal in African countries compared to around 25% in the United States. My son is not nonverbal, but here in the United States, even when we have kids who are nonverbal, we find there are ways that we have to communicate with them because, they're developing all of these things to help them communicate. And you're finding that they're not of low intelligence, but usually very, very smart. However, it's very, very hard to track the autism in Africa. That's why we have this figure of 1 in 160. That's really not taking into account the amount of autism that is going undiagnosed or being diagnosed much, much later in life in sub-Saharan countries. And when it comes to autism, unfortunately, it's much more third world than it should be. And you have to think about when HIV started, what continent and what countries were hit the hardest with this because of lack of medication, lack of information. So I'm not saying with autism that the continent of Africa is being hit harder, but the impact is greater because the children are not being diagnosed early on. Now there is some good news because you have like in countries like let's see, in the country of Mali, they have a parent who has come out, and now they are having the Mali Awareness Center. So they have the Mali Autism Awareness Center. Also in the country of Ethiopia, they have a center called the Center of Joy. And there's, I believe, one in the country of Ghana and one coming in Ivory Coast. But as I said, there are like 50 countries, over 50 countries. I think it's 52 if I'm not mistaken, countries on that one continent. And we've got 4 or 5 that are starting to have, some type of place where people can go and they can get knowledge and also, get the proper treatment. Because the problem is that the medical professionals don't have the knowledge. So because they don't have the knowledge, then they're not able to properly treat these children, and then they don't know where to refer them. You have people from the continent of Africa, from countries over there who have enough money, who have come over to the United States to get treatment. But it's very, very expensive to get the treatment. I thank God that a lot of the things that my son needed when he was growing up was things that were within his education system. And if it wasn't something that was within school, that we have regional centers here in the state of California that would help to subsidize some of those things, like the speech therapy, occupational therapy, physical therapy. All of these things are very, very crucial for people on the spectrum. I'm just trying to make sure that I've gotten other things. Let's see. I'm just trying to make sure I got everything that I wanted to talk about because this is such an important subject. Here we go. Like I said, in Africa versus in the United States, there is a higher percentage of non-verbal children on the spectrum. And they're just now starting to get knowledge in countries over in Africa about that this is a spectrum, because they're just now starting to know about autism. You could have kids who are Asperger's, who is also part of the autism spectrum, who've gone under the radar because they're most of the time are verbal, and they're just a little socially off in many cases, but it's still autism. And the treatment in countries in Africa sometimes is non-existent because they don't believe that it exists. They think that it's supernatural, demon possession, or that it came from the West, from Europe and from the United States, when autism has probably existed for much longer than we've known about it. But the good news is that they are starting to get advances. Medical professionals in Africa, in countries in Africa, are studying the methods that are being done in countries like the United States so that they can become educated, and they're starting to have their own speech pathologists over in their own countries, and behavioral therapists, and all of the things that are really crucial for the children that are on this spectrum, especially because they're underrepresented on the continent. Because, to be honest, when people think of autism, they either think of the character that Dustin Hoffman played in the movie Rain Man, or they think of a little boy who is not of color around the age of 7. Little white boy. That's what they see. But autism affects all ethnicities. And the unfortunate fact about it is that people who are either black or brown, no matter where they live in the world, seem to get the short end of the stick as far as services. So I hope that the information that I've given you guys is very, very helpful in regards to Africa and the autism problem on the continent. I want to just make sure that I'm really getting knowledge out there, as well as telling you about my own life on my channel. So that is all I had to talk about in today's video, and until the next time, guys, thanks for watching and peace.